explorers, and welcome to another video. Today we are going to talk about Azure Blob Storage, or a way of saving object to the Azure platform. And they are using a different terminology than the normal S3 storage, so they are using containers instead of buckets. And they are still using objects, and it works similarly, but of course they could not use the S3 API. They had to figure out some of their own and create another API that you have to implement against. But I have taken the one that we had before, the S3 API client, and I have made it into something that works with Microsoft Blob Storage. So if we switch over to my screen here, we can see a bunch of things. So first off, we have this little command here. They have actually created a client or a service that you can run in Docker in order to test this and test it against a local copy pretty much. So what I have done here is just running Docker and port mapping 10,000 to 10,000. So it will be running on 10,000. I also have mounted this temp directory on this disk to workspace, and this is so we can type the log so I can get debugging. The actual image we will run is microsoft.com Azure Storage Azurite. And then we will run Azurite Blob with the blob host of this current host, 0000, the blob port of 10,000, and debugging information will be written to workspace debug log. So if I look in my temp directory at debug log, I get the logging of the internal service, which is really nice. And to get this down, you can just run docker pool and this address over here, and you will get the actual service. So if we go over here and start our service up, it will say that the Azure Blob service is started on 00010,000. The service is successfully listening on HTTP 00010,000. So nice, we have that up and running. This is my test script I have over here. So it will do a bunch of stuff. Let's just run it and see that it works. So test Azure Blob. Run that down here, and we can see it does a bunch of things here. First, it lists all the buckets or containers. Then it will create a bucket. It will list that bucket, so we have an example bucket. We check if a specific object is available. It is not, so we will put data into that object. We will get the data again, so hello world. And we will delete that data again and see that it's not existing anymore. And then we will put a bunch of data here, and then we will delete the bucket and list that we don't have any buckets. So we can see that all of these functions works pretty much here. We could also, if we want, put in an exist here in between the delete data and so on, so we can see that this function works as well. So here we have hello world, we can say that it exists, and then delete data, and then we see that it doesn't exist. So all these functions seems to work. So what have we done then? Let's look at this and go down to the actual root of our running service. So let's start from the top. And first off, we want to initiate this. We have account name, secret key, host, and a bucket. So those are things that we put in here. Account name is pretty much devel. And then you have a secret key, which is a longer key defined on their homepage. So you just pick those two. The host in this case is the account name dot blob dot and then the domain name for your account. And what I did was that I went into my hosts file. So if we switch over to this screen again, I can open up a new one here, and I can cat my hosts file. So here I have set that my local IP is running against the dev store account 1.blob. In this case, my machine is gamerea.org. So with this host name, I can reach that machine. And the important part here is to have the dev store account and blob in the beginning, because that is something that they're using as a standard. So this is the host name that you will use online, and then these two parts will be added to reach the exact host that we want to run. So those are the things that we put in here. Then we can look at the commands down here. We can say that we want to list the buckets, and it's pretty much doing a get request with the URL of just comp list. And here at the end I have said this is the bucket path, and I make it into slash to say that I don't want to have a bucket path. I don't want to add the bucket, because in this case it doesn't really make sense to have a bucket path when you are listing all the buckets. And then when we get that back, I will do a simple XML element response, where I will create a list where I will put all the containers, and then I do an for each over containers, container, and then I get a specific container as a container here, and then I will push that to the list, and I will push the name as a string to that list, and then I will implode that so I can actually read that list. So not that much code. Creating a bucket, pretty similar. In this case, I could have the bucket name, so I don't need to set the last parameters here. So I just do a response, make call, put against this URL here. So I have to say that this resource type is a container. And if it's something else than false, I have been able to create a bucket. And delete, very similar. Delete the current bucket, and then rest type container, and then it is deleted if it's not false. So the other four functions here is a get, put, exist, and delete data. So the get, very similar. A get against a remote path, so it will use this remote path to fetch a specific object in the bucket. The put operation, pretty much the same. Put the remote path, and then we will need to add the data as well. And then we will get a response back here. And then we have the exist. We just do a head on the specific remote path, and it will return false if it gets a 404. So that's what I will check for here. And then we have the delete data, which is just make call, delete the remote path. And if it doesn't get any errors here, we will not have a falsy connection. So these are all the commands. So now we need to look at this make call, and we have already talked about all these things here. We have the method, in some cases is a get, for instance. We have the remote path in the get data here. We have that set here, so this is the actual thing that we want to get. In the put data here, we will also add the post data, so what we actually want to post to that object. The bucket path we used when we listed buckets, and this content type is never changed, but you could also say that I want to write a specific content type, so that is allowed in the API. So let's look at the next part here. So first we have this check here if the bucket path is set, otherwise the bucket path will be slash and this bucket. So the bucket that is already set here. Then we need to do some date handling. So we will create an UTC date here for now. And then we will use the RFC 850 in order to create this correct date format to send into the API. So this is specified in there. When we want to work with blobs, we will need to add this blob type of block blob. There is also append blobs and stream blobs in order to do other things. But for normal objects that you just write and read and want that kind of access, then this is the best version of that. And then we have a date. There's a date up here, and we will set the Microsoft date stamp here. So these extra parameters here are important. We also need to set the version of the API. There is a bunch of them specified. 2015-02-21 is one of them. I have seen one 2021, which is much newer, but they are very similar in what you need to send in. The newer one has more features and might not require all the actual values to be set. We will calculate the content length of the post data. And then I want to say if the content length is 0, I want the empty string when I encode this. Otherwise, I will just have the length. Because when you encode it in, before it supported 0, but that was in like 2010, not 2015. So the newer version requires this string to be empty when you encode for authentication. So before you could use the 0, but now you can't. Then we also need to parse the path here. So we will parse the path, the remote path, and then we will create a parameter that we will send in later. So first off, we will take the actual path of this remote path and put that in. And that is usually slash and the actual path down to the object. But we also need to handle a query string. So if we have a query string, we will explode all the params with this @ sign, and we will get out all the different values. And then we will explode again against the equal sign, so we get key values. And then we need to put those in with an actual line feed or between all of these. So new line, and then part, and then colon, part 1. So we need to put those on new lines here. And in this specific value, I never send in anything that could be multi-valued. But let's say that you want to include features. So you want to include feature blob and that and that. Then in order to do that, you will use the same key here, and then you will use the comma separated string, even though you send them in multiple times here. But I never do that, so I don't need to really support that feature. Then we need to create a send string here in order to send the data. And it needs to contain a bunch of different things. It could contain a lot more, but the minimal valuable working process here is that you need to have the method first. Then we will have 3 new lines, and then we need to set the encoded length, then 2 new lines and the content type, and then 1 new line and the date. And then we need a bunch of them here. These are pretty much a bunch of search query parameters when you're searching for things, so if match and so on. 6 of those. And then we need the blob type. This is what we defined up here, which is this XMS blob type. And all of these keys need to be lowercase, and they need to be in alphabetic order. Extremely important, or else it will not be correctly encrypted. So then we need the date string and the version string. And then after the first slash here in the path, we will set the account name, the bucket path, and the param path. So these 2 first ones are slash account name slash bucket, and then we have all the params at the end. So we will have the actual object path and then any query params correctly encoded down here. When we have done that, we will have a string that we can encode, and we need to encode it with a secret key, but that is base64 encoded, and we need to decode that before we can use it. So decode the string, and then this send string here needs to be in UTF-8. Newer PHP versions are UTF-8 all the time, so we don't really need to do anything here, and we don't really send in any strange values anyway. And then we do an HMAC, SHA-256 on the whole thing here. And then after that, we will need to base64 encode it into this signature. So that is the value that we will use to sign this message. Now comes the actual call here. So we will create a context for that. In the HTTP call, we will set a method, which is get in some cases. And then we have the header. And here we need to set the host name. Important here, account name, .blob, and then our host. So we need to have the full host that we're actually calling against. And then we have the date. And we need to have a line feed carriage return on both of these. And then we have content length, setting it down here. And then in here we also have, it has to be 0. It can't be the empty string. That's why I needed to have one that I use for encoding and one that I use for the actual content length. And then we have the content type, which we used up here as well. We have the blob type, the date string, and the version string. Doesn't really matter which order we put these, put them in any order. It's only important when we encrypt something because we will not get the same hash if we encrypt them in the wrong order. And then we have authorization, share key, which is their version of this authorization. In the S3, we do authorization or AWS here instead. And then we have the account name, colon, and the signature. And the content is our post data. And after that, we can just do a file get contents against, in this case, HTTP, the actual host name, dot 10,000, and bucket path, remote path, which is the actual where we need to fetch things from. And then we set a false value here and then the context. And this is all we need in order to connect, push a bunch of objects up, and download a bunch of objects. But this is not the full story. I was able to figure this one out and get it working and get it working with this test client, and it was no problem for me when it comes to that. So then I wanted to connect to Microsoft's real servers and do something. And in order to do that, they are not using the port, of course, here, so I had to change that. So let's say we don't add the port. And in order to connect, of course, we need to use HTTPS. No problem there. So these two changes I understand. Those are very intuitive, and yeah, of course you need to do that, or else you can't connect to their service. But when I did that, it did not authenticate. So my thought pattern is we get something working on the test client, then it should work just fine with a real server, right? You test something in order to figure out how to use the API. And when you're actually connecting to the real server, you just get, you're not authorized. And you don't have any logs, you can't debug it, you don't get any information back, which was really frustrated. So I had to do trial and error off and on a lot in order to figure out what was going wrong. And when I read through the specification really bit for bit and every word, it said somewhere, but it was not conclusive, that you use date or date string down here. So either you use the date normal header or you use this Microsoft date up here. So what I did here is that I put in date equals to empty string. So after I have actually created the date, and that made it possible for me to run it against their servers and get it to authenticate. But if I run it against the test server, let's see if it works with both, then I expect it will not authenticate, but they might be more lenient in this server. Yeah, they are more lenient. So it actually works with both when you are running the test server. So this date value here could be the empty string. We could send in an empty date header here, and we could send in the empty date here. It will create a totally different hashed value, and it will also not be the same value as they are printing out to compare with in the GUI, which is just frustrating. So this was what I had to do in order to get to work with Microsoft's live servers, and it might work with the test server as well, but because of both of them working in one case and not in the other case, it was a really frustrating experience. So this was what I wanted to cover today. I hope that you learned something today. I hope that you are not going to be as frustrated with this API as I was. I hope that you liked this video. Give it a like, share it with your friends and colleagues. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. If you have any comments or suggestions, leave them down in the comment section down below. And I really hope to see you in the next video.